Hi, I'm Dr. Angela Akey.
And I'm Dr. Kathleen O'Neill Smith.
Welcome back to the FIRRIMup Doctors, Good Medicine docuseries.
We are so glad you joined us.
We want to provide you with credible health resources, guide you in your treatment options, and fire you up to take control of your health.
Thank you everyone for joining us this happy Thursday. Welcome back to the FIRRIMup Doctors webinar. I'm happy to introduce your FIRRIMup doctors, Dr. Angela Akey and Dr. Kathleen O'Neill Smith. Once again, our emails that you can reach us at are firrimupdoctors@gmail.com, as well as our NFIM hotline, nfimgmv@gmail.com. And today I'm happy to announce that we have a special guest, Dr. Nathan Bryan. He is an international leader in molecular medicine and nitric oxide biochemistry. He's also the founder and inventor of Human to the Power of N, as you can see here. And he's going to be joining us today to talk a little bit about nitric oxide as well as COVID and how they kind of interconnect with each other. So now I'd like to introduce all your doctors. Welcome on.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Emily. This is Dr. Kathleen O'Neill Smith and with Dr. Akey and Dr. Bryan. And we are so excited to be here. It's the end of July and there's an uptick all around the country, but especially in the southern and western states. And so it's kind of wonderful to have Dr. Bryan with us. He's in Texas. And, you know, one of the things that we talked about previously on our webinars was, I mentioned at the Mass General here in Boston, where I am, that they are using nitric oxide for some of the clinicians in the hospital, preventatively and prophylactically. And that made Dr. Akey and I think about who is an expert in nitric oxide and how can we help you understand the value of nitric oxide. So of course, there's Dr. Bryan and we've been in all the same circles with him. So he was kind enough to agree to join us today. So we're going to get some information right from the source on nitric oxide and how that can be helpful for COVID and the pathogenesis of COVID, or what is, you know, how COVID works within the system causing disease. So welcome, Dr. Bryan. We're happy to have you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to join you.
Yeah, we're so happy to have you. It's actually our 20th week. Actually just kind of messaging good strategies on how to get through this COVID-19 pandemic. And I think you're a key part of this in understanding the vascular aspects, as well as what we can do to help our vessels be healthy. So before we get any further, we'd like to give our audience an update on where things are. So if you just stand by and we'll talk about what's going on. Here we are when we first started in March. The red dots are where the COVID cases were. And here we are today. It's quite, it's very red. So today we have California as #1 in cases. We have California, Texas, and Florida. So we're vying for #1 in cases, and that's not a great prize to have. Still, New York has the most fatality. We'd like to update in our areas. So North Central Florida and Boston is what we're going to talk about next. Okay, so in the whole United States, about 4.5 million cases, total tested for over 54 million. Deaths are about 152,000 and 1.4 million recovered. Here in my great state of Florida, 3.5 million tests were done. Confirmed were about 500,000. Hospitalized are about 26,000. We just got one of my patients out of the hospital yesterday, and I'm putting one in as we talk. So it's definitely hit home here in Gainesville, Florida. Deaths are about 6,600. So Alachua County, Dr. Bryan, is the name of my county in Gainesville, North Central Florida. So 3,448 confirmed, 20 deaths. In our practice of 6,000 patients plus, we've done internally 102 serology tests, of which 4 are positive, but a lot more will be positive after this past week. I'm currently managing about 10 COVID patients actively on telehealth. And yeah, it's been kind of crazy down here in Florida.
we went through this in April in Boston and Massachusetts for COVID. And I managed probably 10 or 15 COVID patients, only 1 or 2 who were hospitalized. But in Boston, we are relatively, do not have a lot of current active cases. There's a slight uptick now that we've reopened the restaurants, etc. But we're still really very conservative in terms of our opening strategy. So we have had a fraction of the total test results that Florida has had, and confirmed 117,000 hospitalized, a fraction again of Florida, and deaths still above Florida, but I think not increasing at this point in time. So this is from back in April, several months ago. I think it's important for us to recognize that we are not through the first wave of this. We are still in kind of a continued first wave here with other states, Florida, Texas, California, experiencing their initial testing, positive tests, etc. So we want to be able to continue to help everybody, all states, but especially Florida, Texas, and California, to understand what they can do to keep themselves resilient.
And we're really glad to have you on board, Dr. Kathleen, because Massachusetts and your practice has already been through the initial first wave. So thank you for coming.
Mm-hmm. My pleasure. Next slide.
So here it is in Alachua County over the past week. You can see single digits for new hospitalizations, but I wanted to draw your attention to the case fatality rate in Alachua County is still hovering at 4 out of 1,000. So I want a message to at least my population that if you get sick, you have a very low chance of succumbing to the COVID-19 virus. It might be a long haul like several of our patients, but we will see you through it. Next slide.
So here we are looking again at the, we've seen this slide multiple times, multiple weeks. But what we thought is that we would have Dr. Bryan give us some, an idea of where we need to be thinking about, what's happening with our blood vessels and how we can prevent this pathogen from getting into our blood vessels and creating inflammation. So here we see day 1 through day 28 on the x-axis, and then severity of illness on the y-axis. So my understanding is that prior to day 1 at the Mass General, they were using prophylactically nitric oxide with the clinical staff there. I'm not familiar with what they're doing in terms of testing or treatment for people who are sick, but we wanted to get Dr. Bryan to give us some insight into where we could benefit by understanding the pathogenesis within the blood vessels and the utility of nitric oxide.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. I mean, obviously, this slide looks very familiar because we've learned a lot over the past 6 months. And as you mentioned, even in the late stages, really where people are hospitalized and on ventilation, where the severity of disease and progression of disease has really become critical, and they've started inhaled nitric oxide trials to try to help the patient recover and match ventilation to perfusion and overcome a lot of the pulmonary distress syndrome associated with the later stages of disease. I haven't seen any published data on the inhaled nitric oxide. I think the early reports is that people are getting better. But my thought process, even back in February and March when it was just first becoming an issue, was that if you get nitric oxide on board early in these first, early diagnostic, asymptomatic, or certainly mild symptoms, then that's your best chance of recovery. And there's reasons for that. So number one, in 2005, there was studies published showing that a certain amount of nitric oxide actually inhibited viral replication of the coronavirus. This is over 15 years ago. And so if your body can make nitric oxide, then it inhibits viral replication. And I think that's been corroborated in patients because we know that there are at-risk patients that are more susceptible to disease, and also those patients that progress very rapidly to hospitalization, ventilation, and death. And you guys know this because you're treating these. These are people with comorbidities such as hypertension, diabetes, kidney disease, pulmonary disease, emphysema, COPD. These are all symptoms or comorbidities of nitric oxide deficiency. meaning that their body has lost the ability to produce sufficient nitric oxide to maintain normal cellular and tissue function in those organs. So what happens is, and we're all exposed to viruses, including COVID. Some of us get sick, some of us don't. It doesn't mean that we're not exposed. It means that our body is sufficiently armed to address the early viral inoculation and then elicit an immune response to prevent viral replication. So we never get sick and we never progress to either symptoms or certainly never to hospitalization, ventilation, death. So if there's one message that I have today, it's that if you're scared of getting COVID, then the best thing you can do is to take care of your body, give it what it needs so that it can enhance its nitric oxide production, and then allow your immune system to fight off the virus, and then improve the circulation. Because the symptomology is not only in the active phase of the infection, but a lot of papers have been published showing that the long-term effects of COVID infection are endothelitis, you've got blood clotting disorders, people are prone to stroke, pulmonary embolism, all these so-called collateral, really critical medical conditions that can all be corrected by nitric oxide. I think if you look to answer your question through this, if you're young, healthy, and in good shape, and your body can make sufficient nitric oxide, then you're probably immune or at least resistant to developing of symptoms and the progression of the disease. Where if you get it and you start to show symptoms, then I think it's critical that you begin to employ some nitric oxide-based strategies to basically mitigate all these downstream symptoms, hospitalization, ventilation, and death. I think that's the most critical thing, because nitric oxide is shown to inhibit inflammation, including inflammation of the endothelial cells. It's been shown to match ventilation to perfusion. So if you're having the acute respiratory syndromes of the COVID infection, nitric oxide will actually help that, because in the late stages, you're hypoxic. And as you guys know as physicians, the lungs are unique than any other tissue, because when they become hypoxic, they constrict, hypoxic vasoconstriction, where every other vascular tissue beds dilate. And so that's the mismatch in ventilation to perfusion. And if you give nitric oxide to dilate the pulmonary circulation, then you begin to perfuse those hypoxic regions of the lung and increase oxygen saturation, and the patients get better almost immediately. We've seen O2 stats go from the low 90s to high 80s to 98 or 99 within a matter of minutes.
That's remarkable. It sounds like, so if we just look at it in terms of the benefit of understanding those systems, that first of all, it will inhibit the first phase, which is viral replication. So that's number one. Second of all, even if you're at late stage and someone offers you some nitric oxide inhalation in a hospital setting, then you will also potentially, in many cases, see reversal as well. You'll see improvement in the oxygen that can be delivered through the lungs to the tissue.
Yeah, for the most part, that's true. But again, the inhalative nitric oxide therapy is dose dependent, because too much nitric oxide can cause methemoglobinemia. And that's going to be a problem in critically ill hypoxic patients, because the nitric oxide will oxidize the hemoglobin, the heme of hemoglobin, and prevent oxygen delivery. So you can actually exacerbate the conditions. So too much nitric oxide for too long on a vent through inhalation can cause more harm than good. So I think it's very important to deliver the right amount of nitric oxide at the right time. I think in these critical patients, late phase, inhaled nitric oxide, from what I'm hearing from the clinicians, it's starting to show some improvement and they're getting better. But to me, it's too late. People need to understand what nitric oxide is, the importance of it, to where even if they're trying to be proactive and treat prophylactically, then you have to get it on board. Or if you're just diagnosed, got a positive test, but you don't have any symptoms, it's probably even more important then to upregulate your nitric oxide or take some active nitric oxide products to prevent this whole progression of disease.
Well, that makes sense, because you're saying that the predisposition to getting COVID and having it progress to something that's symptomatic and moderately to severely symptomatic has to do with these initial disease states. And we've talked about that a lot on this webinar with our listeners, basically that obesity, which is, would probably reduce nitric oxide.
No doubt.
Yep, diabetes type 2, reduce nitric oxide, because that's what allows you to progress in that. High blood pressure, kidney disease, we've talked about all of these as, predisposition. And the question people have asked us is, well, can we pull back on the severity of the illness that we have on our medical problem? And of course, we believe that you can. That's why we're all in this together, right? So that's what you're suggesting, is understand how you can improve your nitric oxide status before you end up in a hospital, where then the option is inhaled nitric oxide. And that's a whole different ballgame, because that's, delivered through a medical staff, and hopefully the downside of that can be that it's too little too late. But what we want to do is, we're all about prevention, and we're all about pulling back before anything gets to a severe state. So I love what you said. Can you help us understand, what are some of the natural ways that we could increase nitric oxide?
Yeah, and I think it's important for the audience to know what nitric oxide is. It's a signaling molecule, and it's relatively new in the medical literature. It was only discovered about 30 years ago. So I'm still surprised today by a lot of frontline physicians who know very little about nitric oxide. It's involved in every chronic age-related disease out there. And so by signaling molecule, we mean that it's how cells in the body communicate. So for example, if you need to increase blood flow to a certain region, like at the heart, when you're beginning to exercise, you have to increase blood flow and perfusion to that particular muscle or organ. And you do that through nitric oxide production, which then dilates the blood vessels, and you get more oxygen and nutrients delivery to that tissue. And it's the same in every organ. So if you want to try to recall where you left your keys, you have to increase blood flow to the prefrontal cortex or certain regions of the brain to recall memory. And if you want to perform sexually, you've got to increase blood flow to the pelvic region and to the genitalia. And nitric oxide is what controls the regulation of blood flow. And if you can't make nitric oxide, you cannot increase blood flow to different parts of the body upon need. And so that's kind of the vasodilator signaling aspects of nitric oxide. But it's also how hemoglobin delivers oxygen to the periphery. And without nitric oxide, hemoglobin does not deliver oxygen. So that's a completely different allosteric regulation of oxygen delivery by nitric oxide that was just recognized probably 5 years ago. So the older we get, the less nitric oxide we make. You become more susceptible to not just viral infections, bacterial infections, but you become susceptible to advanced progression of heart disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes, again, every chronic disease. So you asked the $64,000 question is, how do we prevent the age-related decline in nitric oxide production? And it's not rocket science. This is a very complex science, but it comes down to moderate physical exercise, eating a balanced diet enriched in green leafy vegetables. So those are the things that you should do. But perhaps more importantly is stop doing the things that prevent your body's own production of nitric oxide. And this is most recent. So use of antiseptic mouthwash kills the normal good bacteria in the oral cavity that are responsible for giving you the nitric oxide benefits of eating a plant-based diet or beets or green leafy vegetables. So if you're using mouthwash, you have to stop. We've shown that mouthwash makes your blood pressure go up, which then increases your susceptibility to infection. And in fact, using mouthwash prevents the cardiovascular benefits of exercise. So that's number one. Mouthwash is very bad. You have to stop using mouthwash. It's better to have bad breath than have a heart attack. I'm telling you right now. And then the second.
Just so we understand, so the mouthwash changes the biome, so you don't make nitric oxide normally?
That's right. So there's this diverse community of bacteria that lives in the crypts of the tongue and on the gingival tissue in the mouth. And so there are over 200 million Americans that wake up every morning and use an antiseptic mouthwash because they were told by their dentist to maintain good oral hygiene. But the damage, the collateral damage of that, you're not only killing the bad bacteria, you're killing the good bacteria and basically disrupting the diversity of these communities that are partly responsible for the generation of nitric oxide.
Wow.
And this is
Like taking an antibiotic. It's like the gut and taking an antibiotic.
Well, that's the other thing. Antibiotics do the same thing to the oral microbiome. So they disrupt the gut microbiome, they're disrupting the oral microbiome. So that's a very important issue. 200 million Americans wake up every morning.
Antacids, Dr. Bryan, like
omega. Yeah, and the next problem is antacids. You have to have stomach acid to make nitric oxide. And again, 200 million prescriptions are written every year for things like Prilosec, Prevacid, Nexium. And those are just prescriptions. Now you can get these drugs over the counter, so it's really difficult to determine how many Americans are taking antacids. And this is probably, it's worse than antibiotic or antiseptics, because antacids, specific proton pump inhibitors, inhibit nitric oxide from both pathways. So number one, you prevent the reduction of nitrate to nitric oxide through the oral microbiome. And then number two, PPIs have shown to increase a metabolite called asymmetric dimethyl L-arginine, or ADMA. And then ADMA acts as an inhibitor to arginine to make nitric oxide. So when you inhibit stomach acid production, you're completely shutting down nitric oxide production. And in fact, there was data published several years ago out of 21,000 patients that those that have been on PPIs for 3 to 5 years had a 3 to 5 times higher incidence of heart attack and stroke.
That's remarkable.
Numbers. This isn't an increased risk. These are actual events. And the mechanism is very well defined now. It's disruption of nitric oxide production. So it goes beyond COVID. It's basically the key to maintaining health and longevity and prevention of disease.
Well, especially with all of the other things that we're using, I mean, we also have a generalized problem that maybe due to mouthwash, I don't know, maybe you have a thought on that, of hypochlorhydria without the use of with PPIs or proton pump inhibitors. Like, a lot of people have low stomach acid anyway, and that's a really big issue as well.
It is. They're completely separate, but they're disrupting nitric oxide production at different stages. But if you look at the numbers, 200 million using mouthwash, another 200 million using PPIs, that's more than the entire population of the US. So obviously there's some people that are using mouthwash, PPIs, other antacids, and so they're basically, it's creating a very dangerous environment for their health.
It's no surprise then, right, that the cardiac diseases and vascular disease like diabetes type 2, et cetera, high blood pressure are issues.
Yeah, and it's completely unacceptable to me, because we know without a doubt what causes heart disease. It's lack of nitric oxide production. We now have ways to diagnose it and figure that out, and there are ways to enhance it. So the fact that cardiovascular disease remains the #1 killer of men and women worldwide is simply it's unacceptable. And so our job, and what you guys do a great job, is talking to your patients. I've published hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific papers, written numbers of books, both medical and technical books and lay books, but we have to educate the masses, and the patients have to be able to take their health into their own hands and own control, and understand the extent that they can stop doing the things that are affecting their health negatively, and then start doing the things that allow their body to do what they're designed to do. So my thought is that you get sick for 2 reasons and 2 reasons only. Your body is missing something that it needs, or it's exposed to something that it doesn't need. And if you address those 2 things, the body heals itself. It's very simple.
I like that.
Brilliant, brilliant. That is absolutely true, and we are absolutely in agreement.
There's a question about Tums, Dr. Bryan. Dr. Bryan, does Tums affect nitric oxide production?
Well, not to the extent of things like proton pump inhibitors like Prevacid and Prilosec and those types of drugs. But anytime, whether you're adding sodium bicarb, I forget what's in Tums, but it's basically a neutralizing agent that you need stomach acid for total body health for a number of, one, you need stomach acid to break down proteins into amino acids. You need stomach acid to absorb trace minerals like selenium, chromium, iron, and all these other things that most people are missing. And so it's really a bad idea to take any type of antacid. And in fact, it's almost a paradox, because the acid reflux is really a sign and symptom of insufficient stomach acid production. So you need to give your body what it needs to make stomach acid, and you need iodine to make stomach acid. Most people associate iodine with just thyroid function, but you need iodine to make stomach acid in the parietal glands, the parietal cells of the stomach. 95% of Americans are deficient in iodine. So to correct GERD or reflux, I tell people, take iodine. You can get 90 tablets for like $20. It's the cheapest thing you can do.
There's another question about, Betsy wants to know about teeth whitening products and toothpaste and nitric oxide.
Oh yeah, I failed to mention that, but fluoride-based toothpaste, fluoride's an antiseptic. Not only is it an antiseptic, but it's a neurotoxin. So you have to avoid fluoride-based toothpaste because it kills the good bacteria, kills the bad bacteria, shuts down thyroid function. Fluoride is a very bad thing.
Anne wants to know if you know about nitric oxide dump exercises seen on YouTube by Dr. Zach Bush.
Yes. Here's the problem. In people that have what we call good endothelial function, meaning that their body, the enzyme nitric oxide synthase can make nitric oxide, when you do moderate physical exercise, call it the nitric oxide dump or whatever, then that can stimulate the body's production of nitric oxide. The problem is in sick people with endothelial dysfunction, they cannot make nitric oxide. So exercise doesn't stimulate nitric oxide production. In fact, that's why you fail an exercise stress test. If your coronary arteries can't make nitric oxide to dilate the coronaries to meet the increased metabolic demand on the heart, then you have endothelial dysfunction and heart disease. So if you're doing the so-called nitric oxide dump and you have endothelial dysfunction, you're making no nitric oxide. So I think it's good just for people to exercise, but I think it's a misnomer because not everybody's going to be able to generate nitric oxide when you do the nitric oxide dump. You have to restore endothelial function, restore the enzyme that makes nitric oxide. And then when you begin to exercise, your body can stimulate and make its own nitric oxide.
Right.
Yeah, I'd like to share like two cases of COVID patients. One I managed yesterday, a 49-year-old on day 11 of his COVID illness who last year had hypertension, but then he started cycling 20 miles a day to lose weight and fix his blood pressure. And he's having a very mild course, just a very slight cough. I suspect through his cardiovascular exercise, he has good NO, good nitric oxide. And then just an hour ago, I had a 73-year-old man who's relatively sedentary with prediabetes, hypertension, who with the same oxygen saturation, 94%, looks terrible and feels terrible. And I think it has a lot to do with that nitric oxide, how they're doing, right?
Yeah, it is. So with the first patient, if they're on ACE inhibitors or ARBs, that'll cause a cough and also make them more susceptible to COVID infection because of the binding to the H receptor. And then on the second one, you can have oxygen saturations of 94 or even 98. But if your body doesn't have nitric oxide bound to hemoglobin to deliver that oxygen to the periphery, they're still hypoxic. And that's the problem with people who are given 100% oxygen in the ICU and critical care medicine, is that you get their O2 sats up, their hemoglobin is fully saturated, but systemically they're hypoxic because they can't deliver the oxygen off the hemoglobin until you restore the functionality of nitric oxide.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I also have a patient who had COVID back in early April, and I spoke with her this morning, and one of her big residuals is palpitations and heart rates in the low 100s at varying times throughout the day, not related to exercise necessarily, not predictable, just random, just tachycardia, high heart rates in the low 100s. And it's likely that she may need some nitric oxide.
It could,
yeah.
The cardiac system is regulated, right? So if you have a decrease in blood flow, when you have an active infection, in most people, you get a burst of nitric oxide through this inducible to try to kill the infection, which sometimes can lower your blood pressure. So the compensatory response to that is an increase in heart rate to maintain some pressure. So and a lot of medications will cause a disconnect between that. But it could be a number of things.
Yeah, no, she's got a normal blood pressure, at the time.
So Dr. Bryan, Bob wants to know would meds such as Viagra help the COVID-19 since it increases nitric oxide?
No, and that because Viagra and PD5 inhibitors do nothing with nitric oxide. They're downstream of nitric oxide. So these phosphodiesterase inhibitors work on a molecule called cyclic GMP. So when your body produces nitric oxide then binds to another enzyme that produces cyclic GMP. And this is a very, very important point because despite the huge economic success of drugs like Viagra, they only work in about 45% of the men in which they're prescribed. So these are not nitric oxide donors. They're not nitric oxide stimulators. They have nothing to do with nitric oxide. What they do is potentiate the signal that nitric oxide elicits. So if your body can't make nitric oxide, Viagra will not work for you. And we can take non-responders, and we've done clinical trials on this, people who didn't respond to PD5 inhibition therapy, and we increase their nitric oxide levels. They become responsive to PD5 inhibition therapy and improve erectile function, blood pressure normalizes, and actually you can decrease the dose of these drugs to where you improve the safety profile. So Viagra has nothing to do with nitric oxide. Viagra will give you no protection whatsoever from COVID.
No, and actually I've worked with you and your products now for like 4 or 5 years, and I've seen that where I can just use nitric oxide supplementation and get people off of Viagra, getting to and help them with their vasculature at the same time.
Yeah, again, it goes back to this whole concept. If you give the body what it needs, it heals itself. And in that model, there's no room for drug therapy because the body does what it's designed to do.
Perfect. These last 2 questions from Cindy and Betsy. Is there a way to test for deficiency in nitric oxide, and how do you measure it? Well, I've actually used your strips for years now. So do you want to talk about the accuracy of those strips? You basically spit onto, essentially looks like a little felt indicator, and we will show you guys how to get it. But the accuracy of those and your experience?
I tell people it's a good tool to have in your toolbox, but it's just like any other test. There's some false positives, there's some false negatives. And so what we're looking at in this strip is your ability to recycle and regenerate nitric oxide through what we call it the enterosalivary circuit. So if you're low, you're low. There really is no false negative. I mean, if you don't increase the color on that test strip, then you're low. But what it doesn't tell us why you're low. Do you have endothelial dysfunction? Are you using mouthwash? Are you using antacids? Are you not eating enough green leafy vegetables? Those are the kind of questions you have to ask then. But then if you're positive, there are false positives. So the one is if you have an active oral infection, you may be systemically depleted of all nitric oxide, but you've got an active oral infection that'll turn that test strip pink. So it's a good biochemical test, but I think the functional test, there's some FDA cleared medical devices, both occlusive and non-occlusive plethysmography that you can get a readout of your endothelial function. Those are really the best devices out there for measuring endothelial function and nitric oxide production.
You mean like an endopat test?
Endopat, yeah, there's a device called a Max Pulse. There's a number of these out there. There's heart rate variability machines that give you some pulse wave analysis and some algorithms on the stiffness of your blood vessels.
Perfect. There's no more questions from the chat room, so we'll move forward now and start wrapping things up. And so let's just bullet point a summary here. So about nitric oxide, it's, and you can contribute to this, Dr. Bryan, Dr. Kathleen. So it's one of the most important molecules in the body. It controls oxygen and nutrient delivery to all cells in the body. This is really important, especially during this pandemic, that we have good nitric oxide levels. It controls cell communication and has antimicrobial properties to protect the body from invading pathogens. It's a potent vasodilator. It keeps the arteries open and clean to avoid plaque buildup. And I actually use it first line with magnesium at lowering blood pressure very successfully. Foods like beets and leafy greens are rich in nitrate and nitrates that can be converted to nitric oxide when eaten.
Well, let me just add a little point there, because that's mostly true, but we published a paper in 2015 where we went to 5 different cities across the US and just measured the nitrate content of 5 different vegetables and found that there's regional differences. So for instance, if you lived in Dallas or Los Angeles, you could eat 6 or 7 stalks of celery and get enough nitrate to lower your blood pressure, if you have the right oral bacteria and you have the right stomach acid. But if you lived in New York, you'd have to eat like 70 or 80 stalks of celery because those particular vegetables are deficient in nitrate. And this depends on the soil conditions, the amount of sunlight, all this whole field of agronomy. And if you're eating organically grown vegetables, they have on average about 10 times less nitrate than conventionally grown. So organic is good in the fact that you're not getting herbicides and pesticides, but you probably can't eat enough organic vegetables to get enough nitrate to generate any nitric oxide. So that's a big problem.
Is that because of the fertilizer? They don't use certain fertilizers?
That's right. Yeah. There's no standardization of nitrogen-based fertilizers, and all plants need fixable forms of nitrogen to assimilate nutrients. So if a plant is depleted in nitrogen whether it's ammonia or nitrate, they can't assimilate things like magnesium or selenium or chromium or things that most plants and vegetables are deficient in today because of the farming practices. So nitrogen is very important in agronomy as well as in human health.
Well, I'm always talking about low magnesium from over farming, and now I'll add the nitrate story. Thank you.
That's right.
If you had 100 people and you checked them for nitric oxide levels, how many people will have low nitric oxide?
You know, we've done this for the past 10 years at these medical trade shows, and we have a big board that we post all the test strips on. And it's very consistent. Usually 80 to 85% of the people that we test at any given show, and sometimes there's thousands of people that come through, 80 to 80% of the people walking around are nitric oxide deficient. This is a little bit surprising, but it's eye-opening because a lot of these are, you know, very forward-thinking physicians and healthcare practitioners who try to not only take the best care of their patients, but take the best care of themselves. And for them to see that their own body is nitric oxide deficient is an eye-opener. And then it begs the question, okay, what is nitric oxide? How does the body make it? And then how do I improve that? Basically the discussion we just had.
So 8 out of 10 will have low nitric oxide. And those are even mostly physicians, right? You just said.
That's right.
That's how
That's
I met
right.
you about 5 years ago. So, so ways to increase your NO naturally: physical exercise, moderate physical exercise, eat green leafy vegetables with that asterisk that Dr. Bryan just told you about farming practices and regions. Don't use antiseptic mouthwash, and maintain good oral hygiene, sufficient stomach acid.
That's right on. It's very simple. It's that simple. So do the things you're supposed to do. Good balanced diet, lots of green leafy vegetables, stay active, moderate physical exercise, and then stop doing the thing that that stops your own body's production of nitric oxide. Mouthwash, fluoride, toothpaste, antacids, 3 biggest things.
Could you get enough NO and beets if you eat like 10 beets a day, 3 beets a day? Like, what's your thought on that?
I mean, it's very difficult to answer that question because if you lived up in the Northeast, probably not. And we've tested a lot of beet products that are on the shelf at Whole Foods and a lot of the retail outlets, and most of them, it's a dead beet product. There's no nitric oxide activity whatsoever. In fact, we use these commercial products as our placebos in our clinical trials. The only thing that's going to do is turn your urine and poop red and give you a little bit of anxiety. It's not going to provide any benefit whatsoever.
Wow. Well, this was amazing, amazing, amazing. So wonderful to have your knowledge and to bring it to our group. We appreciate you. We appreciate the work you do, and keep it coming, please. Keep educating.
Thank you. You guys keep up the good work too. You're doing a great service to your patients and the community as a whole.
Yeah, thank you for coming and spending a half hour with us, Dr. Bryan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a beautiful day.
Next slide. So I wanted to introduce to you his work. Dr. Bryan studied with the man who got the Nobel Prize for finding nitric oxide. He's a solid scientist, and these are his products. So basically, over to your left is the nitric oxide indicator strips that I told you about, where you just spit on it, and if it's purple, it's very you have a lot of nitric oxide, and if it's faint pink, you have barely any, you're depleted. Then you have Neo 40 Daily, which is not quite as strong as Neo 40 Professional, which is what I use. The Neo 40 Professional to your right, if you were to come into our office and you spit and you were depleted, the dosage twice daily for a month and 1 per day, and we monitor you with strips. I have helped so many people with erectile dysfunction in guys and hyposexual disorder in females, right? So, but as well, the other categories I use these products on are my elite athletes and people who are training heavily, especially cardiovascularly. The second category is people with peripheral vascular disease and coronary artery disease. And then the erectile dysfunction / hyposexual dysfunction in women. But actually, through this pandemic, I've actually, especially if you have high blood pressure, trying to prepare you to get COVID, or if you early got COVID, we actually have been recommending these products to help the perfusion to your lungs. And like I said, yesterday I saw a 50-year-old athlete who's cycling 20 miles per day coming into this who cured his hypertension last year. He's doing well despite being on day 11 of his illness, and day 10 through 14 is when I worry about the lungs. Whereas just now I'm admitting a 73-year-old man with metabolic syndrome who is pre-diabetic and is sedentary. So his nitric oxide levels by definition are quite low. So I'm worried about him, and he's going to the hospital as we speak. Next slide. Okay, I think that will wrap it up for us today. Any other thoughts, Dr. Kathleen?
No, I think that was really wonderful. I think he is just such a, just an astute, well-respected scientist, and we were so lucky to have him join us and share that information. And I think it was really helpful for what people can do even if they have a medical condition, to pull back, from one phase to another, severe, moderate, or low risk. And I think that that's really important to know. What can you do? And I loved how he simplified: you're exposed to something or you're deficient in something. So those are the two ways to think about your well-being. Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. This is week 12 for my community and about week 9 for our combined community. So thank you. So happy you all are following us on Facebook and now on Twitter. And please share the link with all your friends and family from all over the globe. We're so happy to be able to have these conversations because we care deeply that you be safe, be well, and God bless you all. Thank you, Dr. Kathleen, for coming.
See you in August. Everybody have a good day. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to finish up by talking about some of our supplements and deals, and then we will wrap up for today. So a few of you were asking if we have these products in our office. We do. You can also get them on our website, which is going to be, sorry, I can't see because of my screen, but it's on the screen. It's going to be our FIRRIMup Get Healthy store up here at top. We will post it on Facebook as well as on our website, FIRRIMupDoctors.com. If you use this code FIRRIMUPPRO between today and August 13th, you can take 10% off of each of the 3 products that Dr. Aki had talked about before. Here they are: the indicator strips, the tablets, and then the professional lozenges. On our website, you can read all about them. They're clinically tested, everything that you need to know you'll be able to find online. You can also call the office to ask any questions you may have, or email us at firrimupdoctors@gmail.com or nfimgmv@gmail.com. And then for our July special, which is, again, if you buy our guidebook, either paperback or ebook, you can get 20% off of ultra potent vitamin C and zinc AG. This does end tomorrow. So if you want to take advantage of this 20% off, you will need to call or come into the office by either 4:30 today or tomorrow until 4:30 as well. You can always call or email, but since it does end tomorrow, I would suggest maybe calling or going in person. Again, our ebook is available as always on Google Play for $9.99, and we are actually now also on Barnes & Noble website. You can purchase it as an ebook as well. It's going to be in the same exact format. You'll be able to read it the exact same way, but it's going to be the same price, just on a different platform. And again, this is all while supplies last, and you will have to show proof of a receipt, either your receipt from your paperback that we will give you at the office, or just a screenshot that you purchased our book online. Again, you can buy our book and search for all these supplements and deals at FIRRIMUPDoctors.com. And you're always welcome to give us a call or send us an email, and we will try to reach out as soon as possible. I thank you all for joining us today, and we will be back next week with a new topic and to update on some COVID statistics. So I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend and happy August.
We're so glad you joined us today.
We hope we've given you the tools to take control of your health.
For more good medicine and information about any treatments, supplements, and resources discussed today, please visit us at www.FIRRIMUPDoctors.com. That's FIRRIM Doctors.com.
And wherever you're listening from, remember to like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube and podcast channels so you don't miss out. The information provided is not a substitute for professional medical advice. This should not be used to diagnose, treat, or manage health problems without consultation. If you do experience any of the symptoms discussed today, please contact your nearest healthcare professional.